I'm Christy Miller-Bell.
And I'm Lori Behrens. Welcome to the Well-Worn Pages Book Club, where we discuss classic Christian books that point us to God and His Word.
Find the show notes for this episode and more at wellwornpages.substack.com. So let's get to it. Pull up a chair and join the conversation. Have you ever missed God's movement because you were looking for something more spectacular? God doesn't waste anything, even our rebellion. This is what we're talking about on today's episode of Well-Worn Pages, where Christian classics meet everyday conversation. I'm so excited, Lori. It's our
Oh, me
first
too.
podcast.
Yay.
Yay. I just want to start with telling everybody welcome. I'm glad you're here and give you a little bit of information about myself. My name is Christy Miller-Bell, and I am a writer of Bible studies and devotional books. And I should be having a devotional book coming out in the next month or so, as of the recording date today. And it will be called Hope in the Darkness. And it's a devotional book based on the book of Jeremiah. I'm excited about that coming out. I live in Alabama with my family. My husband and I are actual empty nesters officially. We have 3 kids. I homeschooled all 3 of my kids through all years of school. And so we have studied the Christian classics and we love Christian classics. I love to read. And I guess now I can add I'm a podcast host. So yay for that.
Yay.
And my podcast co-host is Lori Behrens, and we're excited to be here together. So Lori, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm so excited. As we've said, we've done a lot of planning and we're finally here getting to record and do this
Yay!
first episode. Well, I'm Lori Behrens and I live in Texas. I'm married to my pastor husband, and we have 4 adult grown kids. We have 2 sweet grandbabies. I'm also an author. I've written a Bible study. It should be out this fall, so fall of 2026. It's a Bible study on Psalm 119, finding joy in God's Word. I guess now I can say I'm a podcast host too. So just so glad to be here.
Excited about that. And we want to dive into our first book. We're studying this month the book entitled God's Smuggler by Brother Andrew. And I just wanted to give you a little framework of how we're going to do this podcast. We are going to divide our podcast up for this book according to themes instead of chapters. A lot of book clubs do chapters or even do a whole book in one episode, but we're going to break this episodes up into 4 different episodes that discuss themes, because the themes weave together the questions that we asked ourselves as we were reading. And so I'm excited about covering some of those questions today.
So today's episode is our first discussion of the book God's Smuggler by Brother Andrew. Now, Brother Andrew was a Dutch missionary, was born in Holland. He ended up smuggling Bibles into closed countries. He also went on to found Open Doors Ministry, which we'll put the link to their website in the show notes, and you can find a lot more information on their website. Just kind of give you a time frame. He was born in 1928, and he passed away in 2022 at 94 years old. So that kind of gives us a little bit of time frame of when he lived and how we'll talk about how his background shaped his ministry and the way God led him in life. But the book God's Smuggler was influential. It was originally published in 1967 and really is like a story of his life. So it talks about him, how he just his growing up years, and then how he got into the ministry and how he started smuggling Bibles into countries and where that led. And then after this book was published, it ended up hindering his own travel into these countries. So still other people in his ministry could travel, but he couldn't travel into these own countries as freely. So then after the fall of communism in Europe, he ended up focusing a lot on the Middle East and the persecuted church, strengthening the persecuted church in the Muslim world. And he has ended up writing 2 other books that address this work in the Muslim world. So the first question that we are going to talk about is, how did Andrew's background influence his future? And how does God use events in our lives to shape us? It starts off the first chapter to talk about his childhood and how he was really an adventure-seeking kid. He dreamed of being a spy when he was a boy. So he's got this personality that God created that really sought the adventure and the which reflects in his smuggling Bibles into countries that didn't allow the Bible to be in there. Then when he was 12 is when Germany invaded Holland in World War II, and that led and with that, along with his sense of adventure, led him to end up going into the army, and we'll talk more about that. But I think our challenges of that he grew up in this country that was at war. We can't really relate to that as well. I can't personally relate to that as well. One of the things we talk about just how God uses things in our lives. When he was shipped off to go into the army, his mom wanted to send her Bible with him. And one of a quote that I'll read from this was I thought was really interesting. That so she says, Andrew, will you take this with you? And of course, I said, yes. Will you read it, Andrew? And he says, can you ever say no to your mother? You can do no, but you can't say no. So he took the Bible, put it on the bottom of his duffel bag, and as far as down as it would go, and forgot about it. He still took the Bible, but I just love that quote. As being a mom, I could so relate to that, and even myself, that you could say, you can do no, but you can't say no to mom. So I just think it's
No,
amazing how God uses all that.
I know I really love that quote too, and I'm mom of 3, and I thought, that's very true. But I think also what stood out to me about that was that irony of, he stuffed that Bible in the bottom of his bag, and yet that's what he ended up doing for his life's work. This was,
Yeah,
of course, before he was saved, but I
yeah,
thought that was really cool just to think about how God even uses those tiny little things that we never even think about.
it really is.
So we're gonna keep going in that same frame of thought, but one of the things that I really enjoyed was just seeing him be so very real about his struggles. That's not something that we all really want to talk about. I know if I wrote a book today, I probably would not talk about the darkest times of my life in that book. But, he told about those things and the struggles that he had. But what was so cool to me was that God was always drawing him. And even in those letters, I think in there it talked about him writing letters to different people in the war, and one of
Mhm.
those girls that he wrote to was a girl named Theo. I don't know. The names in this book were really hard to pronounce, so we're gonna slaughter them. They're gonna be terrible. But,
Just say it with confidence.
that's
Yeah.
right. Confidently, I'll say her name wrong. Um, Theo was one of the women that he wrote to, and she was a Christian, a believer, and she pushed him to read more about the Bible. She probably didn't know he had a Bible with him, but as they talked and exchanged letters, she pushed him to read more, and so he was even reading the Bible and thinking about the Bible even before he was saved. And then once he was injured, later on, it talks about how he was shot in the ankle and he was injured and put in the hospital. And that was a place where God just kind of brought him down to the very bottom of, who he was and depending on other people. And so, I mean, even in every little moment of his life, God was drawing him into relationship, which is such an amazing thing to me.
Yeah, Andrew had a friend in the army, Jan, who they had a falling out over a monkey that Andrew was keeping, and but it ended up being that God restored that friendship, and it ended up he used Jan even to be the one who had got brought Andrew's Bible after Andrew was injured and in the hospital. Jan was the one that brought his Bible, his mom's Bible that he had found it in there in his duffel bag, and brought it and just kind of shyly, it says, put it at his bedside and left it there, even though Brother Andrew wasn't looking to read it. But it's just amazing how God uses all kinds of even someone we don't know if Jan was a believer or not, but he uses very unexpected people in our lives. That Bible was at by his bedside, and the nuns were the ones in the hospital taking care of him. There was one nun who he had just says he just fell in love with the nuns that were helping to take care of him, and one of them one day he asked her why she was so cheerful, and she replied, "It's the love of Christ." and she taps the Bible that's by his bedside and says, "You've got the answer right here." And I thought how God has just woven all that together, that he's in the hospital with nuns taking care of him, with believers taking care of him. He has this Bible that his mom has sent, even though he had no intention of reading it when he took it. This friend, brings it and leaves it by his bedside, and then the nun sees it there, and it just gets them to thinking, and just amazing how God works in our lives.
Yeah, I love that because it goes into our next question about how God uses all of those things. And Andrew's surrender to God was not something that happened immediately. It was
Mhm.
intentional, but it was also very gradual. And that was something that I thought was really cool because I think a lot of times in our Christian faith, especially, we think, well, there's a one time when I pray a prayer and I'm saved. But God starts drawing us years and years before we ever get to the point where we're ready to surrender to Him. And if we look back over our own lives, I know in my own life, I can see the ways that God brought me to Him to where I just can't, it's amazing to me to think about. Um, but he was reading the Bible, he was studying it, but he didn't understand what it meant. And he was still going out and getting drunk. And I think it's one of my favorite stories in this first part of the book was when he was in the hospital being taken care of by the nuns. It the monkey was something really special to him in the army. Had a really cool relationship with that monkey that he took care of. And so not knowing that he had that experience, the nun actually read told him a story about a monkey, and that piqued his interest, and I wanted to read a little part of that because this goes to show how powerfully God was using just the little tiny things like the monkey and the nuns and this injury and all of these things in weaving all that together to bring him to himself. And it says, as soon as I was ambulatory, I started leaving the hospital every evening after dinner to hobble painfully to the nearest pub and drink myself into oblivion. The nuns never spoke about it, at least not directly, but on the day before I was to be shipped home, my favorite nun, Sister Patrice, pulled up a chair to my bed. Andy, I have a story to tell you. Do you know how natives catch monkeys out in the forest? My face lit up at the thought of a monkey story. No, tell me. Well, you see, the natives know that a monkey will never let go of something he wants, even if it means losing his freedom. So here's what they do: they take a coconut and make a hole in one end just big enough for a monkey's paw to slip through. Then they drop a pebble into the hole and wait in the bushes with a net. Sooner or later, a curious old fellow will come along. He'll pick up that coconut shell and rattle it. He'll peer inside, and then at last he'll slip his paw into the hole and feel around until he gets hold of that pebble. But when he tries to bring it out, he finds he cannot get the paw through the hole without letting go. And Andy, turn the page. That monkey will never let go of what he thinks is a prize. It's the easiest thing in the world to catch a fellow who acts like that. Sister Patrice got up and put the chair by the table. She paused for a moment and looked me straight in the eye. Are you holding on to something, Andrew? Something that's keeping you from your freedom? And then she was gone. I knew perfectly well what she meant. I also knew her sermon wasn't for me. The next day, I was going to be the next day was going to be a great one on two counts. It was my 21st birthday, and it was the day this hospital ship sailed for home. To celebrate, I called together all survivors who could still walk or limp of the company had come to Indonesia with 3 years earlier. There were 8 of us. We had a grand time. We got roaring, shouting, belligerently drunk. So, I mean, even in the midst of what, he knew God was using that story to talk to him, but he just wasn't ready to give up his freedom yet. So, that
He was
was
still running.
he was
Yeah,
running. That's right, the
yeah,
whole time.
yeah,
I think it's then a few weeks later, of course, you read that he is invited to a church service and he only goes because the girl is pretty. So
yeah.
he, I mean, God uses all kinds
Yeah.
of things.
Oh, yeah.
So the song at the service that they sang was Let My People Go. And he thought back to that story that the monkey held on
Mhm.
to. And he thought that those two things are connected. There's something here that I need to grab a hold of. but he still didn't get it. He dove into Bible study. Instead of surrendering, he thought, well, I'm just going to read the Bible. Maybe that's what I'm supposed to do. And I think that's a key idea because we have, you know, a lot of people are looking for the right answers in the wrong way. They think there's all these things to do to become a believer. You know, I've got to go to church. I've got to read my Bible. I've got to pray. I've got to witness. And those are all good things, and they're all very good things for Christians to be a part of, but the first thing has to be the first thing. We have to come to that moment where we surrender our lives to Christ and we let go of our freedom in a way that we let go of our own way of doing things. And then God gives us real freedom. That's where true freedom comes from. And he just didn't understand that yet until the moment that all of that kind of came gelling together in his mind.
Mhm.
And I wanted to read that quote because I thought that was such a beautiful picture of what God does in our lives. He was laying in his bed asleep. He wasn't at a church service. He wasn't doing any great work. He was just laying on a pillow in his bedroom, about to go to sleep, and everything just kind of settled on him at one time. And he said, the rest of the house was asleep. I lay on my back with my hands under my head, staring at the darkened ceiling, and all at once, very quietly, I let go of my ego. With a new note in the wind yelling at me not to be a fool, I turned myself over to God, lock, stock, and adventure. There wasn't much faith in my prayer. I just said, Lord, if you will show me the way, I will follow you. Amen. It was as simple as that. And I think that's it. It was that intentional moment of surrender that God was doing all of that to bring him to.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, our surrender, is both intentional and gradual. I mean, he had that intentional moment, but we've seen the gradual way that God led him, there. And I think we can all, relate to that. We can look back. We don't realize it at the time, he didn't
Mhm.
realize at the time all these different pieces. We kind of look back at it. But yeah, I think it's so gradual how God works, but there is, like you said, there is a moment of intentionality that he says, I gotta do something. A lot of times he lets us hit rock bottom or we feel like, before we will actually surrender. But yeah, he had that intentional moment. But yeah, it's just so cool how God, all the different ways though that God led up to that. All the people he used, even people that weren't necessarily believers, just the
Mhm.
situations and even his rebellion, he was running from God. God doesn't force us to make those intentional choices, but he does, put things in our path, people in our path or situations in our lives that will lead us there. So yeah, sometimes it's that gradual surrender too. So he intentionally surrendered in making that decision for salvation, and that's, the most important. But, it's also God still continues to work in our life after that. That's not the end. We make that choice and that's just the beginning of, that was the beginning of his great adventure. That was the beginning of his he continued to gradually surrender from there on. And one of the things that really stood out to me was just, I think it's in the same chapter, but just a few pages later, he kind of gets to the, and I'll read the quote, but he kind of gets to, he's at a point where he knows he's made this intentional decision to follow God, but he says, he's at a point that he hasn't reached a point where he knew for sure what God's plan for his life was. So, he thought it was going to be the army. He thought, he's got all these things we've talked about, his sense of adventure. So he still wants to do something, but he really wants, now he's focused on God and he wants it to be God's plan for his life. So he goes on and he said he gets to a point where he's taking a walk and he prays and he says, "What is it, Lord? What am I holding back? What am I using as an excuse for not serving you in whatever you want me to do?" And then and there by the canal, I finally had my answer. My yes to God had always been a yes, but. Yes, but I'm not educated. Yes, but I'm lame. And with the next breath, I did say yes. I said it in a brand new way without qualification. And then he continues on and says, Lord, as I stand up from this place and as I take my first step forward, will you consider that this is a step toward complete obedience to you? I'll call it the step of yes. And I love that step of yes that he finally, it was still that gradual surrender that he went through, saying, okay, I don't know what you want me to do, but I'm just going to take the first step. And he even, I love his humility, in that he even just says it as a prayer, as I stand up, will you will you take this as my first step forward? His humility in asking God that, and just saying he's going to take a step in obedience, and he gets up and he strides forward and took his next step forward. He had a sharp pain in his leg, and God ends up healing his legs. There's so many things that these all these pieces work together. Him calling it the step of yes, and literally was a step that God then went through, healing his ankle injury, and the ways that he did it. It's just amazing.
I love that because I think I have a pastor friend in the church, and he used to say, "Put your yes on the table."
Oh, I like
And
that.
that is just something that's saying, your obedience is not, it's not you doing something. It's you being willing to do the thing and putting it out there and being willing to let God
Mhm.
work. So I think that's really cool. I love that you brought that out because I think I miss that totally, that step of yes, and then God immediately healed him of his injury, that he was able to do the thing that God called him to do. And
Yeah.
that was really cool. I missed that totally, so that's awesome.
That's
I
why I
think
love doing this together, because there's so
that's
many things that you
right.
bring out that I go, "Really? Are you sure?"
Yeah,
If
and
y'all
then
could see
you're like,
behind the
"Wow."
Yeah, if y'all could see behind the scenes and all the things that I'm like, "Really? I missed that." We both have done
Well,
that so
speaking
much.
of missing things, sometimes we miss God's movement because we're looking for something more spectacular, and I think that
Mhm.
brings us to our big question that we ask at the beginning of the episode. Have you ever missed God's movement because you're looking for something spectacular, looking for that big event that happens when we've seen already how God has moved quietly and slowly, steadily all the time, but God just uses all the different experiences in Andrew's life to bring him to salvation and then to bring him into ministry. And one of the things I think really stood out to me was when he was applying to work, and he one of the things that stood out to me was the time when he got the job at the chocolate factory. And I think he thought that was gonna be some grand thing that he did for God after he got saved and he surrendered his life to ministry. I'm not sure what he planned, but I know when I felt the call to ministry years ago, I thought missionary in Africa, or I'm gonna be this grand person who, everybody's gonna wanna follow because and it was all about me. It wasn't
Yeah.
really about me being
Oh, I
obedient to
can
the
relate.
Lord.
Yeah.
So, I think that we really need to look for the smaller things and recognize that God uses those things in our lives too, and that was what the chocolate factory was. It was a small step in obedience. It was in his hometown, and I think he thought it was gonna be some grand thing. In fact, you can read about that in the book. He talks about that on page 50. He says, the night before I biked to another one of those names I don't know how to pronounce to apply for the job, he had a wonderful dream. He dreamed the factory was full of despondent, unhappy people who noticed at once that I had something different. They crowded around me, demanding my secret. And when I told them the truth, the truth dawned on their faces, and together we knelt. And it goes into he woke up, and I think that tells us that he was dreaming about some grand thing. I'm going to walk into this place and they're all going to realize they're sinners and they're all going to think,
Mhm.
oh, this man has the answer and great revival. And that's not at all what happened. In fact, it was complete opposite of what happened. But God used that job for some really great stuff. That's where he met his future wife. He witnessed his first salvation there, and then he learned how to minister in a quiet way that didn't bring attention to anything. And that we'll see was a very key thing for what he was called to do much later on. So I think that was really one of the ways that God used that job in his life. One of the quotes that I thought was really good that later on when he meets Mr. Hopkins, this is a few pages on in, but he meets Mr. Hopkins, and we can talk about him some other time, but he quoted something really cool. He said, "Time and place are our own limitations, Andy. We mustn't impose them upon God." And I
Mm,
think that really fits with what we're talking about with the idea of missing the small moments that God uses, because God calls us to obedience in those everyday events. I mean, he called Andrew to be a missionary, but he also called people like Mr. Ringers, who owned the factory, to be a believer in the place that he worked. He called Mr. Hopkins to minister to people that most people wouldn't minister to, or even from his childhood, Mr. Westra, who was a consistent presence in his life, praying for him. Those are, or Carl DeGraff, the guy who taught him to drive when he didn't even know he needed to learn how to drive. These were small people in small towns with a minuscule ministry. Maybe they ministered to just a few people, but these were, without them being obedient in those everyday tasks, they were the support that made Andrew's job possible. And so
mhm,
that tells me, like in First Corinthians, it talks about how we're all called to be part of the body, but God determines our role. He's the one who shows us the role that we're supposed to play. And we don't have to look for those huge events in our lives. We just need to be faithful to the thing that God has called us to do. I think about Elijah in the cleft of the rock, where God sent all of the
mhm.
big, he sent the fire and the
Yeah.
storm, and that wasn't where God was calling Elijah to look. He called him in the gentle blowing wind, the small, still voice that God spoke to Elijah in that moment. And I think, yes, there are always gonna be the great things that God does in our lives, ways that he works in miraculous ways, but there are also everyday events that we will miss if we're not paying careful attention to what God's doing. So I love that God brought that out to me in the story.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of the story in Second Kings with, Naaman. He's a leper and he's ends up going to Elisha for healing, and, Elisha tells him to go wash in the Jordan, 7 times the Jordan River, and he's mad. Naaman is angry because he thought he would come out and stand and call on the name of God and wave his hand over the place and cure him. That's what he's expecting. He's expecting this big show. He says, aren't the rivers in Damascus better than the Jordan? So it's all about the physical and the big show. And even his servants say, hey, if he had told you some great thing, wouldn't you have done it? So how much more then when he says, wash and be clean? So finally Naaman goes and finally obeys the little thing and is healed. And how many times do we miss, like you said, how much do we miss by looking for the big thing and completely ignoring the little things that we're called to do? And you have to be faithful in the little things before, a lot of times before God will give you big things to be faithful with, because you've got to learn to be trustworthy and faithful with everything that God gives us, every opportunity. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I love that.
Even there was the magazine article that he read when he was first figuring out what he was gonna do, and he came across a magazine article that talked about a youth rally in Warsaw. It appealed to his sense of adventure. He wanted to go check this out and see what all it was about, and, he didn't overthink it. He just took the opportunity and went. He contacted him, and he got accepted to go, and he went, and that was really kind of, I feel like, one of his first trips that started, his ministry and started his travels. And it was just a small, subtle thing, an article in a magazine that he just happened to find, which we know things, God orchestrated it, we
Right.
know. But the fact that he didn't just read it and think about it for a while and say, oh, maybe next year, maybe if they do another one, or maybe, that's what I tend to do. I tend to look for
Mm.
I'm like Gideon, I want all the signs,
Yeah, all the
Yeah.
answers right in a
Oh,
line.
yeah, exactly. I want it all to be it's all about me, right? It's all
Oh,
about,
yeah.
but he didn't. He just took the opportunity and he went. And, a lot of that I think, reflects his personality, the way God made him, like we've talked about, his sense of adventure, his, wanting to go and do, and, even doing something big for God. He's just ready to go and whatever God leads him. But that's just how the magazine article began his ministry.
Yeah, and I think that is interesting that you said that because I think a lot of times we make those excuses like he did before, or
Mm.
we're hesitant because we think, well, I don't know how I could possibly do that. Well, and again, the focus is on us. It's not about what we can do, it's about what God wants to do through us. And I'm reminded of Romans 8:28. God works all things together for good, to those that are called. And we're all called to serve him in one capacity or another, whether that's a full-time ministry or even just at church in what we're doing or in the community. If we're a believer, we have a job to do. And I think
Mhm.
the lesson that we can learn from Andrew is that he was willing to step into that yes and to say yes to God no matter what that meant.
Yeah. And, we see all the example of like you were just saying, no matter where God puts you, even when he was working at the chocolate factory, he saw that as a opportunity, but God used that to teach him how to witness to people or how to do things like that. So you could see that as a small thing, working at a chocolate factory, in
Yeah.
this town. We see so much of how God used that. And had he been seeking the grand thing so much and not gone to the chocolate factory, what he would have missed on his training that God would use. So today we have talked about how nothing is wasted and God used everything in Brother Andrew's life, in our own lives, how God weaves together all the little details of our own stories and to create something beautiful and something that honors him. And I think that's the difference. When we're focused on ourselves, it's completely different than if we focus on how God can use us to glorify him. And we've seen how God used people and circumstances in Brother Andrew's life to shape who he became and how his ministry developed. So, we're at the end of our episode, and we hope you have enjoyed this discussion today. And we would love to know what stuck with you as you read this week, or just what you got from this episode that stuck with you. So join us next week as we discuss, would you have the courage to follow God when all the evidence says no? Or what about when obedience means facing real dangers? We'll look at that in Brother Andrew's life and how his ministry and how he faced that. So I'm Lori Behrens.
And I'm Christy Miller Bell. We'll see you next week.
Bye. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you're enjoying the book club. Leave us a comment and share with a friend to help us grow. You can also subscribe, join the community, get discussion guides, and more at wellwormpages.substack.com.
We want to leave you with encouragement from the best Christian classic of all, the Bible. Jeremiah 6:16 says, "Thus says the Lord, stand by the roads and look, and ask for the ancient paths, where the good way is, and walk in it, and find rest for your souls."